Yeah, and each week, one of the fun things about what we do here is that we don't have like one talking head presenting the truth every week, but we hear from a diversity of speakers on all kinds of life topics, and sometimes we have out-of-town guests, sometimes we have people from within our community, and today is one of those days. Today's speaker is not just part of our community, almost an indispensable part of our community. She came up with the idea for Meeting of Minds, the potluck luncheon, and does so much else around here, and we're thrilled to welcome her today as the presenter of our main talk. Let's give a warm welcome to Verena Kallhoff.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mike. And back in November was the 25th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, and it's been a very memorable event for me. As most of you know, I am originally from Germany. Now, at the time, I was a fairly young child, but regardless, that event has very much stuck with me. And so I approached Mike to take the opportunity to talk to you all about it. And while I was doing the research for this, I realized I really didn't know a whole lot about it. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to find out more about it. One of the things, obviously, I mean, it's kind of hard to see the Berlin Wall separated from everything that was going on at the time. And I decided to, rather than going really into the end of the Second World War and kind of what led up to it and kind of what led up to that, to really just start with the formation of the Allied Control Council. So in the late, actually throughout 1944, it was becoming fairly apparent that Germany wasn't going to win this war. And the worry was that overall chaos would break out once the very centralized political and administrative structure would collapse. And so the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain kind of got together and tried to figure out what they would do with Germany after they finally surrendered. So they formed the Allied Control Council to hopefully govern the country, govern the affairs of Germany post-surrender. France was added later in to the council, but of course, France was a little preoccupied trying to get Germans back out of their country. And of course, their government wasn't all that effective at the time. They really didn't have a whole lot of resources. So it was while it was added in, it didn't have a whole lot of duties. The end of the Second World War came about, and this is actually something that's always that I needed to remind myself, because for me the Second World War ended in 1945. I know for you all it didn't. And so when I moved to the United States, I had to remember that there were other parts of the world that were still fighting, and that the United States was still fighting. And for Germany, well, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945 in Berlin. He handed power over to someone else who surrendered on May 8th. And essentially, the political, military, and administrative structure of the country collapsed. Everything before was very centralized, very much going towards Berlin, very much orders coming out of Berlin. And so that none of that was there anymore. And so the four powers, well, really, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France became the four occupying powers and kind of divided up the country. And so this is essentially the way it was. You had the Soviet Union here on the east, and the rest, well, the United States here, and then, of course, in the port around Bremen and Hamburg, and then Great Britain in West Germany. And this is actually right over here is where I grew up, just in case you cared. No, Berlin was very different. Berlin had been such a center of power, and it was located smack in the middle of the Soviet sector. But they ended up dividing it among the four powers. So it was surrounded by the Soviet sector, but in the middle of it was Berlin, governed by all. Now, the way it was set up is that the governing forces were supposed to make decisions in unison. They were not supposed to just take over each sector on their own and do whatever they wanted with it. The same for Berlin. Berlin actually had a very different status from the rest of Germany. It was supposed to remain one city. It was supposed to be governed together. Assumptions are really nice, but didn't work out that way, as we all know. So in Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin, in 1945, everyone got together and decided, yes, they were going to demilitarize Germany. They were going to get rid of the political structures. They were going to put in democratic structures, start eliminating a lot of the industrial cartels, and just decentralize, denazify, and just make it more in their image. Now, when I say their image, of course, the image that the Soviet Union had in mind and the image that the other powers had in mind were very different. And it already became apparent at the time that the political interests really didn't line up very well. So very shortly thereafter, the Western sector started reflecting very much what was going on in the United States, Great Britain, France, their political system, democratic systems, privatized economy. Of course, the Marshall Plan helped the Western sector quite a bit. While in the Soviet Union, you really started seeing the reflection of what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, which was a single-party communist party, a centrally planned economy where somebody was sitting there and deciding what they were going to produce for the next 5 years, and deprivatization of land, deprivatization of industry. As a matter of fact, they disassembled a lot of the factories, moved stuff over to the Soviet Union, and so they really just forced it back into an agricultural land, more or less. And by March 1948, the Soviet representative left the Allied-controlled council because it just wasn't working anymore. Now, throughout this time, you had a lot of migration going on. As most of you know, at the end of the Second World War, Germany lost a lot of the lands over on the eastern side. So there were already about 11.5 million people on the move, just leaving what was to become Poland, Czechoslovakia, what had been parts of East Prussia, etc. Now, in addition to that, everybody was trying to find their family. We'd been moved all over the place. People were trying to find food, trying to find work, just trying to build a new life, hopefully with people they had known, family members from who'd just been spread all over the place. Now, in the Soviet sector, there were some additional pressures that because you had to fall in line with whatever they were thinking, and the economy wasn't doing so great over there. Well, it wasn't doing great anywhere, but it was worse over there. And so what ended up happening is that, at least for the Soviet sector, you had more people leaving it than coming in to look for family, look for food, look for work. And so the Soviets and East Germans really, East German government really didn't like that very much, that so many people were leaving, and decided on the first Berlin blockade. So Berlin, because of its status as a single city, it wasn't very well separated from what was to become East Germany. So people would go to East Berlin, from there into West Berlin, from which part they could leave over to West Germany. So there was too many people leaving, and they figured, well, if we close that off, they're not going to get any more food, our people aren't going to leave anymore, and essentially what it was a modern form of a siege, where rather than sitting around a moat around a castle, now you were trying to starve out a city, the city of Berlin. And that started the Berlin Airlift. It went on for almost 13 months. The U.S. Air Force, the Royal British Air Force, as well as the Royal Air Forces from Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and Canada were essentially bringing in supplies at the rate of one plane landing every 3 minutes. Now, I think, especially for those times, that's a pretty good feat. But what they achieved is that the people didn't starve to death. In addition to that, the occupying powers really became trusted friends, because people realized, okay, we're not sitting here on an island by ourselves. They're actually committed to letting us survive, to establishing what Berlin is. And of course, it showed the Soviet Union they weren't going to give in all that quickly either. And this is another thing that that maybe was a little bit funny to others when I first came to the United States. Whenever I saw war airplanes, bombers, hey, those are raisin bombers. And people thought it was kind of strange. But it is what they were in my mind, because while the airplanes were bringing in all the supplies, one of the pilots fairly early on started dropping candy to the kids as he was entering into Berlin Tegelhof airport. And so that became the thing. People here were collecting candy, so the pilots, as they approached Berlin, could drop candy to the kids. Raisin bombers, right? Just after the first Berlin blockade ended, they started a currency reform, at least in the West. The economy was so stabilized, black market was running rampant, everybody was doing whatever they wanted to do, and so they figured, well, we need a new currency. And so in June 20th, the Deutsche Mark was established in West Germany. A couple days later, because now what happened when you had a currency that really wasn't any good anymore, you took it where the currency was still good, which was the Soviet sector. And a couple days later then, the Soviets decided, well, we probably ought to change the currency over here as well. So at that point, while nobody really wanted to admit it, you had Germany with two different currencies. Now, how much more separated can you get? A little bit more. In May of 1949, die Deutsche Demokratische, Bundesrepublik Deutschland was established. Die Deutsche Demokratische Republik followed in October of the same year. Goodness, I can't even speak German anymore. No, I'll do that later. So at that point, yes, you had two separate German states with separate governments, and as a matter of fact, very different political systems, very different economical systems, just two very different states. Around the rest of the country, now there was obviously an inner German border, as well as the border around Berlin or around West Berlin. It was essentially initially just a demarcation line. Was already controlled access since 1946, and they closed it on occasion just because so many people were leaving. And really, early on, you needed an interzone pass to go between between East Germany and West Germany, and that was something that was required by both governments. The Berlin border, as I mentioned before, remained passable, so as long as you could make it to East Berlin, you could make it to West Berlin, at which point you could hop on the train to go straight out into West Germany. So there was a continued emigration from the Soviet sector or East Germany. Then by the time East Germany was established, 1.9 million people had left it. Many of them were young, educated. So those were not the ones you really wanted to leave. So what they figured out is, well, we got to try to keep these people in. So what better way to do that than by force? They established a police ring around West Berlin, and also built essentially an inner-German border, a true border by 1952. It was 850 miles long. And what they had to do, I mean, they essentially relocated villages, relocated people. No big deal, right? In Berlin, a number of the streets got closed just to keep better control of who was coming in and who was leaving. Now, that didn't really stop people from leaving, though. By 1954, East Germany made it illegal to flee the Republic. By 1957, it became illegal to plan or attempt to leave the Republic. And they were no longer issuing a lot of travel permits. Students didn't even need to apply. You just were not eligible for it. Certain age groups, job categories just don't bother applying because you're not going to be allowed to leave the country. Now, on the western side, it looked a little bit different. They opened up Marienfelde, which was essentially a camp once you had made, it was in West Berlin. Once you made it out of East Berlin or the East in general, you could go there. They would start the integration process. They would set you up process, you put everything in place, and you no longer needed an interzone pass to get into West Germany, which probably was helpful because it's not like you could have gotten it in East Germany. Oops, going the wrong direction. There we go. The second Berlin crisis followed in 1958. Khrushchev proposed to make a free city of Berlin. Now, what he really wanted to is get rid of the rules that had been established at the end of the Second World War that allowed the Allied forces to be present in the city. And obviously, the US, Great Britain, and France weren't too keen on that, because what it would have essentially done is leave Berlin as an unprotected city in the middle of the Soviet sector of East, well, actually at that point already East Germany. And so they were not too keen on that because they were afraid the Soviets were going to take over. So Kennedy went in 1961 and said, no, we're committed. We have the right to be present in Berlin. We have the right to freely enter the city. We have the right to secure its existence. And what he said was, we have the right to do all of this in West Berlin. This was the first time that he essentially admitted that there was a West Berlin and an East Berlin, rather than a city of Berlin. So in the same summer, summer of 1961, the propaganda machine of East Germany really started revving up. What also started revving up is the emigration with kids getting out of school. For the summer break, people started leaving much more. And the East Germans decided, okay, this was all due to human smuggling. At least that's what the propaganda said. They were also arresting human smugglers. They were essentially going after people who lived in East Berlin but worked in West Berlin. They put a lot more restrictions on these people. They were now having to relinquish some of their wages as they were coming back. They were having to pay a lot of their bills in Deutsche D-Mark, in the Westmark, rather than the Eastmark. And later on, they essentially said, well, you're just going to have to look for work in East Germany. You're no longer allowed to do that. And the propaganda was that West Germany, BRD, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, was planning to invade East Germany and Poland. I guess we had a little bit of a history of that, so maybe that went over well, I don't know. And then in June of 61, this was something that actually, when I talked to my mom about wanting to give this talk, this was the first thing she said. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten. This was Walter Albrecht. He essentially said, nobody has the intention of building a wall here. This was in June of 1961. Well, this happened in August of 1961. The wall had already been decided on by the time Walter Albrecht made that statement in June. That was decided in April or May of 1961, that building the wall would be the solution to the slow economic growth and steady increase in emigration. Sunday, August 13th, 1961, at 1 a.m., they closed all the crossings. They put barbed wire around the entirety of West Berlin. This was 100 miles. They didn't just decide that at 11 p.m. the night before. They had been pulling in the people, they had been pulling in the supplies, they had gotten everything in place for the prior 2 months or so. So by 1:30, you had a complete occupation of all train stations. Nothing was going in, nothing was going on, although there might have been one train station that you could still get out of. By 6 a.m., they had torn up streets, they had removed rails, and they had essentially, for all intents and purposes, closed off West Berlin. This is the way it looked. You had the barbed wire, you had the guards, and you had people trying to say goodbye because they knew what was coming. The first wall that was built was a cinder block wall. Not very high. I mean, you see, people could still look over it. It was maybe about yay high. Barbed wire on top. So nobody had the intention of building a wall, right? The reaction from the West was something that a lot of people were looking for, and there was not a whole lot. the U.S. increased the troop size in West Berlin. It restated its commitment to West Berlin, but they didn't want another war. The only thing they said, at least openly, was that they appealed to the East German border guards to not shoot their own people. Tells you a little bit. So when we think of the wall, of the Berlin Wall, we think of that picture that was right the beginning slide, but that's not all there's to it. There were additional inventions. Some of it was started very early on, some of it were added throughout the next 20 years or so. One of the first things they did was build ditches right behind that cinder block wall. Because as you were driving up in your vehicle, you were trying to run down the wall, it wasn't going to happen because you were dumping into a ditch, first thing. Then, of course, they had barbed wire barricades. They had alarm fences. If you touched it, you didn't know. It was just barbed wire on a couple of posts. If you touched it, the guards were alarmed on either side. They knew exactly where you were. But you didn't know that they did. They had Stahlengras, which I thought was very interesting. Well, what's Stahlengras? What it is 14 centimeter long steel nails coming up from the ground. There was about a meter or so of that. In some areas that weren't very easily visible, they put automated weaponry. So if you got into it, it would start shooting. They put fencing in sewage canals very early on in the August of '61, because people realized very quickly that they could still escape through those sewage canals. They put the fences up in there so you couldn't use that anymore either. And they painted everything white. And of course, they had everything lit up at night as well. Whitely painted, you were very visible. A very easy target. So Neukölln, this is the ditch I was talking about as they were digging it. And I think this gives you a little bit of an idea. Initially, you had, I'm trying to orient myself now. You had the first wall, then you had, this is a ditch. So this is the first wall with some barbed wire on top. The ditch, a couple more barbed wire things, and then you had another wall on the inside of Berlin. So there's a couple more pictures of it just to show you the, I hesitate to use the term, evolution of the wall. You had a fairly easy wall, a fairly low wall, I should say. Initially, later on in the late 70s, another wall was erected, which we essentially know as the Berlin Wall. What that was, Grenzmauer 75, was now 3 meters and 3.5 meters tall. So that's about twice as tall, a little over twice as tall as I am. It had been designed in such a way that it was going to be very hard to breach. On top of that, they had put a tube on top of it, so you couldn't really grab onto anything if you should manage to make it there. The way they developed a lot of these barricades was actually very interesting. When they decided on using Grenzmauer 75, they would put up all of these different options that they had at their stations, at their military stations, and essentially charged their personnel with try to figure out how to get across this. And if you get across it, let me know how you did it and how long it took you. And that is how they decided on this one. And if you, I think it's kind of hard to see, but the bottom of it, there's another 2 meter long foot to the wall that would be reaching into East Germany. Because if you were trying to run it down with your vehicle, you were essentially steadying the wall with the front tires of your vehicle when you were trying to run it down. So another view of the border structure. You have West Berlin over here. You have Grenzmauer 75. You have a bunch of other structures behind it. The whole strip would be the death zone, the death strip, Todesstreifen. There were a number of escape attempts at the wall. 2,500 border patrolmen fled. About 5,000 people overall made it across alive. The first death occurred not even 2 weeks after the Berlin Wall was built. This was a young guy who had been in East Berlin to visit his family for that weekend, the weekend of August 13th. He worked in West Berlin, but he every weekend would go and visit his family in East Berlin, I'm sorry. And so a couple weeks into it, he decided he needed to go get back to where he lived and where he worked. As they discovered him, he jumped into the river, and they shot him while he was trying to swim across. Overall, we know that 136 people were killed at the wall, 89 trying to flee, another 30 just because they didn't really seem to have any intentions to go, a couple border patrol agents. And then there were also 200 deaths at the border crossings, where they were afraid they were just going to make a run for it, and they didn't have the right paperwork or whatever else. The last person killed at the wall was on February 5th, 1989. Most of the individuals killed at the wall were young guys. And one of the things I should have mentioned is they were starting to put up the barbed wire. You had literally people jumping out of buildings that were adjacent to what was to become the wall, jump from the east over into West Germany, where the firefighters were essentially standing with these big old things, just trying to catch them, just trying to make that. People were just trying to do whatever they could. They were also trying to, air balloons were forbidden, hot air balloons. Yeah, and the trick about those was really, once you made it up into the hot air balloon and you kind of flew, when you came back down, you couldn't really be sure that you ended up in the right country, right? So it's actually, I mean, that will be a subject for another talk, just to understand all the different ideas they had, the different things that they tried to get out. Now, there were a lot of mitigation attempts when it came to trying to help people who were wanting to leave East Germany. Visitation passes were first allowed for people in West Berlin to go visit their family in East Berlin. Now, if you were in East Berlin and you had family in West Berlin, they would have to visit you. You could not go and visit them. They, and by that I mean West Germany, purchased political inmates from East Berlin, which probably was a pretty good source of income, because from what I understand, this was not a cheap endeavor. And eventually retirees were allowed to travel from East Germany over into West Germany. East Germany, as well as the rest of the Eastern Bloc states, tried to kind of align themselves a little bit more with the international community in the 70s. And so there was a lot of pressure on East Germany as well to reduce this, incarceration really of their people. So they started allowing a few more people to travel. By 1984, the wish to leave East Germany there just were more and more people who wanted to get out. In 1984, they decided, okay, we're going to issue 21,000 visas for people who want to leave. At the same time, they started an arrest wave. What they were hoping was that, the arrest wave is going to get people to be afraid of applying for more visas. It's going to reinforce that we really mean this. But people really saw, hey, 21,000 made it out. And so that never decreased. Emigration, people just continued to want to get out. One of the things, and I only threw this in here because it was one of the things that really drove home the emotion of the country at the time. Now, when this happened, I was 8 years old? I remember not much about the incidents per se. What happened is Chernobyl, April 26, 1986, they decided to have a planned power outage to see what would happen if they had to shut down reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear plant. This was a planned outage, but they had value engineered out a lot of the safety feature, and the thing blew up. We in West Germany didn't know much about this. What we did, however, figure out was that radioactivity levels were increasing by a lot. Now, our government didn't know what really was happening other than radioactivity was increasing. And they didn't want to tell us anything because they wanted to figure out what had happened, whether or not somebody had bombed somebody or who knew. I remember our neighbor come to our house, and my mom and her conversing in the foyer when my neighbor said, well, there's just radioactivity everywhere. Don't let the kids go out anymore. We were eating and drinking essentially things that had been processed, produced before the end of April of 1986. I think it took the Soviet government a couple weeks to admit to what had actually happened. To see the fear in my neighbor's eyes and in my mother's eyes, not knowing what had happened, just trying to react, trying to keep their family safe. That is what that separation of Europe, the separation of Germany was about. Fear. So by 1989, just a few years later, you had an extremely bad economic situation. The planned economy apparently didn't work out very well for them. The population increasingly grew discontent, and in East Germany was essentially insolvent. Opposition groups had been forming since the mid-'80s, and they had become better organized. They had aligned themselves. And of course, the Eastern neighbors, there was a lot of change that was going on. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev had restructured, or started to restructure their economy to make it a little bit more like an open market. And the Eastern Bloc states were also allowed to govern themselves now. Poland initiated the transition to a democratic system with elections in April. Hungary disassembled the border and allowed essentially free passage by September of 1989. And so, of course, what East Germany did in response to Hungary opening up their border was to forbid East Germans to travel to Hungary. So they went ahead and went to Poland and Czechoslovakia and occupied the embassies in Prague and Warsaw, trying to force the government to let them into West Germany. In the fall of 1989, yay, East Germany, we have our 40th anniversary. Let's celebrate, right? East Germans at the same time got the permission to go to West Germany, the ones that had occupied the embassies in Prague and Warsaw. By October 9th, you had 70,000 people just marching in Leipzig. This is a lot of people, a lot more than had ever taken to the streets there at the same time before. And the military and the police just didn't want to intervene because it was just too many people. Too many people. And you started getting a lot of Monday demonstrations. Now, these had arisen out of Monday peace prayers. That Leipzig was certainly one of the places that this had started in the early to mid-'80s, where people would just get together in the churches and pray Monday night for peace. I mean, we did it. Every time I went to service, we prayed for peace. And we knew exactly why. Monday evenings, that was the time to do it. And now they started to have Monday demonstrations, and they would just get out on the streets rather than trying to stay hidden. Then November 1989 rolled around. 500,000 people, 500,000 people now took to the streets and demanded a democratic overhaul of East Germany. Immigration waves continued, but of course over the other eastern states. And so these states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, they were putting pressure on the East German government. They had just undergone a big change themselves. They couldn't handle all these thousands of people coming through their country, just trying to get over to West Germany. So they put a lot of pressure on East Germany as well. And so East Germany decided, okay, well, let's make it a little bit easier to give visas. So they changed the travel rules and announced the travel rules as well in a press conference that East Germans may now request travel visas without a reason. So nobody had to be dying or what. I mean, you didn't have to have a reason to go to West Germany. You could just apply for it. And one of the correspondents asked, well, so when is this going to be in effect? And the guy didn't have a good answer, so he just said, well, immediately. People misunderstood that. What they were supposed to do was go to some kind of administrative building, apply for a travel visa. What they understood, hey, we can go. And so they took through the streets, they marched towards the wall, and the guards at the wall assumed they had missed the memo rather than starting to shoot. Again, chances are a big part of it was because there was just too many people. And so, yeah, I mean, if all these people think they can go now, well, then I guess they can go. And that's what you get. I remember just watching it on TV. For some odd reason, I mean, I was, almost 12 years old by that point, but my parents didn't want me to go to Berlin for whatever reason. We were sitting there, and we were listening to all these changes going on, and there were news every evening, just one after the other. We always watched the 7 o'clock news in the second channel, and then the 8 o'clock news in the first channel. And just to sit there and see people walking towards the wall and getting up on top of the wall after having been separated for so long and just having lived with, okay, well, that's just the status quo. That was amazing. That was absolutely amazing. And so what I want to play for you today is a song that to me just represents everything that was going on. Actually, let me go into my last slide while this is trying to do its thing, and I pretty much know what's on the last slide. One of the things that I took away from it, and I think that's something that still carries me today, despite all the stuff I have, encountered since then, is hope that we can all just get along, and that it's really people just getting together who make a difference. Human hands solve human problems, right? So it's just and it is something that continues to carry me. That we can get along. Humanity is still evolving. I truly believe that we are, as overall people, better today than we were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and I hope that 200 years from today we'll be more ethical, more moral, and just in general better people. I truly hope that. I truly think that. So, did you hear that we could be like brothers again? Because that's really what it was. The wall separated families, and it doesn't anymore. Let's hope we won't let that happen again. Thank you.